Vittoria Marchetti's wineglass did not shake as she set it down beside her untouched plate, and that stillness was the first thing that told everyone at the table something had already been decided long before she opened her mouth. "I want a divorce," she said, and the dining room of the Marchetti estate, filled with 22 members of a family that did not tolerate surprises, went utterly silent around her. Her husband, Renzo Marchetti, did not flinch. He set down his fork with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, dark eyes fixed on her across a table lined with candles and silver he had inherited from a father who built an empire out of fear. "Say that again." "I want a divorce, Renzo, tonight, in front of everyone, so there's no version of this where you convince me otherwise in private later." Somewhere down the table, his mother's hand froze around her own glass. His younger brother, Salvatore, looked between the two of them with the particular alarm of a man watching a controlled fire suddenly jump its containment line. But Renzo only studied his wife for a long moment, the 4 years of their marriage compressed into the silence between them, and then he did something no one at that table expected. He nodded once, slowly, and said, "Granted." Vittoria had prepared for many outcomes walking into that dinner. Rage, threats, a cold, calculated refusal delivered with the particular menace Renzo reserved for people who tried to take things from him. She had not prepared for immediate surrender, and for one unguarded second, something flickered behind her composed expression that looked almost like doubt. He noticed. He always noticed. And he smiled, faint and humorless, the kind of smile a man wears when he believes he already understands exactly how a story ends. "She'll be back within the week," Renzo told Salvatore later that night, standing at the window of his study with a glass of something amber in his hand, watching the taillights of the car that had taken Vittoria to a hotel disappear down the long gravel drive. "She has nowhere else to go. No family that would take her in against mine. No money that isn't tied to accounts I control. She'll beg to come home, and I'll let her, because that's how this always ends." What Renzo Marchetti did not know, what none of them knew, was that Vittoria had spent 4 years inside his house, not as the soft, overlooked wife his organization had assumed her to be, but as the deepest and most patient asset the Caruso family had ever placed inside enemy territory, and she had just walked out the front door with everything she needed to finish the job. Vittoria had come into Renzo's life 4 years earlier under circumstances that looked, on paper, like nothing more than a convenient marriage brokered between two families trying to maintain an uneasy peace. She had been introduced as the daughter of a minor associate with distant ties to legitimate business, plain in the way that made men in Renzo's world underestimate her instantly, soft-spoken, comfortable in her body in a way that read to them as unambitious rather than simply unbothered by their standards. She had let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe. It had taken discipline she never spoke about to anyone. 4 years of smiling at dinner parties while memorizing shipment schedules mentioned in passing conversation. 4 years of being handed ledgers to organize because no one imagined a woman built like her could possibly be dangerous. 4 years of being underestimated so thoroughly that the underestimation itself had become her most effective weapon. Renzo had married her for the alliance it represented, nothing more, and had never once bothered to hide that fact from her. He was not cruel in the obvious ways. He did not raise his voice, did not raise his hand, offered her every material comfort his empire could provide, but he had also never once looked at her the way he looked at the ledgers on his desk, with genuine attention, with the assumption that anything meaningful might be happening beneath the surface. That blindness had been her opening from the very first week, and she had used every day of the 4 years since to widen it. She remembered the early months of the marriage with a clarity that still surprised her, the way she had cataloged every habit of the house without appearing to pay attention to any of it, the way Renzo took his coffee black and reviewed his father's old ledgers every Sunday morning before the household staff arrived. The way his mother kept a second set of books hidden behind a false panel in the pantry, believing no one clever enough to find them would ever be foolish enough to marry into a family like theirs. The way the men who came to the house for private meetings assumed the wife pouring their wine was simply part of the furniture, invisible in the specific way that only a woman deemed unthreatening could be invisible. Vittoria had built her entire operation on that invisibility, brick by brick, conversation by half-heard conversation, for 4 years, and she had done it without a single person in that house ever suspecting the softness they saw in her was armor she had chosen to wear on purpose. She checked into a modest hotel across the city that night, not the kind of place anyone would expect a Marchetti wife to choose, and sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on, finally allowing herself to exhale for what felt like the first time in years. Her phone buzzed with a message from a contact she had not spoken to directly in months, careful and coded the way all her communications had needed to be. The arrangement is complete. Confirm extraction proceeds as planned. She typed back 3 words: proceeding as planned. She did not sleep much that first night. She lay awake staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, running through 4 years of memorized detail one final time, making certain nothing had been left behind in that house that could unravel everything she had built. She thought, too, of Renzo standing at that dinner table, the flatness in his voice when he'd said the word, "granted," and she told herself the small ache that thought produced in her chest was simply exhaustion. She had told herself that lie so many times over 4 years that she had almost stopped noticing she was lying. Renzo gave her exactly the week he predicted before his composure began to show its first hairline cracks. She did not call. She did not appear at the estate gates begging for reconciliation the way he had assured his family she would. Instead, quiet reports began reaching him through channels he trusted. A shipment intercepted with impossible precision, a meeting location compromised that only a handful of people had known, a rival family suddenly aware of movements that should have been sealed tighter than anything in his organization's history. "Someone is feeding information out of this house," his consigliere told him grimly, 3 weeks after the dinner party divorce. "And it started the same week your wife walked out that door." Renzo's jaw tightened at the suggestion, an old, familiar defensiveness rising in him before he could examine why. She barely paid attention to business. She organized dinner parties and household accounts. She wasn't in the room for anything that mattered. She was in the room for everything, Renzo. She was in every room for 4 years. We simply never thought to notice her there. The words landed with the particular weight of a truth a man does not want to accept, and Renzo found himself, for the first time since the divorce, doubting the story he had told himself about exactly how much power he'd held in that marriage all along. He began, carefully and privately, to reconstruct 4 years of memory through a different lens, and what he found unsettled him more than any rival's threat ever had. The way Vittoria had always been present during his most sensitive phone calls, seated quietly with a book or needlework, invisible in the specific way only someone deliberately cultivating invisibility could manage. The way she had asked, early in their marriage, to help organize his late father's old files, framed as a dutiful wife's gesture and accepted without a second thought. The way she had attended meetings with rival families at his side, smiling and silent, absorbing details he had never once imagined she found interesting enough to remember. He remembered, too, a night 2 years into the marriage when he had come home from a difficult negotiation, tense and short-tempered, and she had simply sat with him in silence for an hour without asking a single question, and he had thought at the time that her silence was emptiness. He understood now that it had been patience. She had been waiting the entire time for him to say something useful. He pulled the household staff aside one by one over the following days, asking careful, indirect questions about the years he had barely paid attention to, and each answer added another brick to the wall of understanding rising in his mind. The housekeeper mentioned that Vittoria had always requested the study be dusted last, after everyone else had gone home for the evening, giving herself unsupervised time alone in the one room that mattered most. The driver mentioned that she had asked, more than once, to be dropped a few blocks from her stated destination, always with some plausible errand attached. None of it, alone, would have raised suspicion. Together, it painted the portrait of a woman who had spent 4 years constructing a life entirely out of small, deliberate gaps that no one had ever thought to notice. He found her, eventually, not through his own network, but through a name a contact mentioned in passing, a woman matching her description seen entering a building associated loosely with Caruso family holdings on the other side of the city. Renzo stood in his study staring at the address written on a slip of paper for a long time before he understood, with the particular clarity that arrives too late to prevent damage, exactly what 4 years of his life had actually been. He went to her anyway, not with soldiers, not with the fury the situation would have justified in anyone else's eyes, but alone, driving himself through the city at night with a stillness that unsettled even him, because some part of him needed to hear it from her directly before he could decide what it meant. Vittoria was not surprised to see him standing outside the small apartment she had moved into after leaving the hotel. She had expected this confrontation from the moment she'd walked out of his mansion, had planned for it the way she planned for everything, and she opened the door without hesitation, meeting his gaze with the same steady composure she'd worn at that dinner table weeks earlier. "You know," she said, not a question. "I know." His voice was quiet, controlled in the particular way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. 4 years, Vittoria. I want to hear you say what you actually are, in your own words, before I decide anything else. "I was sent to marry you," she said plainly, without flinching from the truth of it. "My family believed your organization had grown too powerful and too careless, and they wanted eyes inside your house that no one would think to watch. I agreed, because I believed in the reasons behind it, and because I was good enough at disappearing into a room that no one ever thought to look for me there. You let me believe you were harmless." Something in his voice cracked slightly on the word, an old wound surfacing that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with pride. "You let everyone in my family believe it." "I let you believe what you already wanted to believe about me," Vittoria said. "That's not the same as lying, Renzo. You saw a woman who didn't fit the mold of what a boss's wife should look like, and you decided that meant I couldn't be dangerous. I never once told you that. You told yourself that, and I let the mistake work in my favor." He absorbed that in silence, the accusation landing somewhere he clearly hadn't examined before, and Vittoria watched something shift behind his dark eyes, anger giving way slowly to something more complicated, something that looked almost like reluctant respect fighting against genuine betrayal. "Why the divorce?" he asked finally. "If the work was already done, why the performance at dinner in front of my entire family?" "Because the work wasn't finished until I was outside your walls with everything I'd gathered," Vittoria said. "And because I was tired of being invisible in a house where I mattered enough to gather 4 years of intelligence, but never enough for you to actually see me standing in the room." The admission cost her more than she intended to reveal, a flicker of something raw passing beneath her careful composure before she reined it back in, and Renzo caught it, the way he caught everything, filing it away with the same instinct that had kept him alive in a world that punished carelessness without mercy. "You could have told them anything," he said slowly. "You could have finished this quietly and disappeared without ever standing at that table. Why do it in front of everyone? Why give me the chance to see it coming?" Vittoria held his gaze for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice had lost some of its careful control. "Because some part of me wanted you to know it was me, not a stranger's betrayal you'd never have to reckon with directly. Mine. I wanted you to spend the rest of your life knowing exactly whose hands held the knife. The confession hung in the space between them, dangerous and honest, in a way neither business nor marriage had ever required of either of them, and Renzo studied her with an intensity that made the small apartment feel suddenly much smaller than it was. "That's not the confession of someone who felt nothing for 4 years," he said quietly. "No," Vittoria admitted. "It isn't." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them, both of them understanding, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever existed underneath the mission and the marriage and the betrayal was still too tangled to name safely. Not yet, not with the danger still circling both of them from every direction. He asked her, before he left that night, why the Caruso family had chosen him specifically, and she told him the truth, because there seemed no longer any purpose in withholding it. His father, in the final years of his life, had made a private arrangement with a rival faction that Renzo had never known existed, a quiet agreement to divide certain shipping routes that the elder Marchetti had broken the moment it stopped benefiting him. The Carusos had spent years documenting that betrayal, waiting for the right moment and the right access to prove it beyond dispute, and Vittoria had been the instrument of that patience. Renzo absorbed the revelation about his father with the particular stillness of a man discovering that the empire he had inherited was built on a foundation he had never been permitted to examine. He left her apartment that night without another word, but he did not sleep either, turning the truth of his father's dishonesty over in his mind long after the conversation had ended. The danger arrived faster than either of them expected. Within days, word reached Renzo that his own family, humiliated by the scope of what Vittoria had extracted, and desperate to reclaim some measure of control, had authorized a response that went beyond simply severing ties with the Caruso family. A senior member of his organization, a man Renzo had trusted since childhood, had taken it upon himself to locate Vittoria directly and ensure she could never testify to what she knew or hand over anything further. Renzo learned of the plan only hours before it was set into motion, and the realization of what was coming struck him with a force that surprised him more than the discovery of her true identity ever had. He had spent weeks telling himself he felt only anger and betrayal. Standing in his study with the knowledge that men from his own family were driving toward her apartment at that very moment, he understood with sudden, unwelcome clarity that anger was not the only thing he felt at all. He arrived at her building minutes ahead of the men his own organization had sent, taking the stairs 2 at a time, and found Vittoria already alert, already moving, a small bag packed by the door, as if she had been prepared for exactly this outcome the entire time. "They're coming," Renzo said, breathless in a way he almost never allowed himself to be. "I know," Vittoria said. "I've known for an hour. I have somewhere to go." "Not without me clearing the path first." He caught her arm gently, urgency overriding every careful boundary he had maintained since learning the truth about her. "They won't listen to reason from anyone but me right now, and even that might not be enough." They moved together through the building's rear stairwell, Vittoria's calm precision matching his own step for step, neither of them speaking as they descended into the alley behind the building, where a car waited that Renzo had arranged in the frantic minutes after learning of the plan. The men sent to silence her arrived at the front entrance just as Renzo's car pulled away from the back, and for a tense, silent stretch of minutes, neither of them breathed easily until the city had swallowed them into anonymous traffic. "You saved me," Vittoria said quietly, once the immediate danger had faded into the hum of the road beneath them. "After everything I did to you and your family, you still came." "I told myself for weeks that what I felt was only anger," Renzo said, eyes fixed on the road, jaw tight with the effort of the admission. "Standing outside your door tonight, I understood that was never entirely true. I don't know what that makes me. A fool, probably. My father would have called it weakness." "Okay, or it makes you someone who finally saw the person in the room Instead of the wife he assumed I was, Vittoria said. 4 years too late, but not never. He glanced at her then, something unguarded passing across his face in the dim light of passing street lamps, and the moment stretched between them, charged and fragile, neither of them reaching to close it, both of them feeling the pull of it anyway. They found temporary safety at a property Renzo had inherited that his own organization did not know about, a small house on the coast his father had kept hidden even from his closest advisors. And in the quiet of those first uncertain hours, something between them finally settled into honesty neither had allowed themselves before. The house was cold when they arrived, shuttered for years, and Vittoria moved through the rooms, opening windows and stripping dust sheets from furniture, with the same efficient calm she brought to everything, while Renzo stood in the doorway, watching her make a stranger's house feel briefly inhabited. He found himself thinking that this was perhaps the first time in 4 years he had simply watched her move through a space without an agenda of his own attached to the observation, and the thought unsettled him more than the danger they had just escaped. "What happens now?" Vittoria asked, standing at the window watching the dark water beyond the property's edge. "You can't simply return to your family after tonight. And I still have information that could end what's left of your organization entirely." "Then perhaps neither of us returns to what we were before," Renzo said, coming to stand near her, close enough that she could feel the quiet weight of his presence, without either of them closing the last remaining distance. "I built my entire life around an inheritance I never chose and rules I never agreed to. Perhaps it's time I decided what I actually want, instead of what was handed to me." "And what do you want?" Vittoria asked, turning to face him directly. "I want to know the woman who spent 4 years in my house without ever once needing me to see her clearly," Renzo said. "Not the wife assigned to me, not the spy who outmaneuvered my entire family. Whoever exists in between those two things. I want the chance to see her properly this time, without assuming I already know what I'm looking at." Vittoria studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculation she had learned to expect from every powerful man in that world, and found something else there instead, something unguarded and genuinely uncertain in a way she had never once witnessed from Renzo Marchetti in 4 years of marriage. "That's going to take more than one conversation," she said finally. "I have nowhere else to be," Renzo said. "And for the first time in longer than I can remember, nothing I'm required to protect except whatever this actually is." They stayed at the coastal house for 3 days while Renzo quietly worked channels within his own organization to contain the fallout, calling in loyalties his father had built decades earlier to buy time against the men who still wanted Vittoria silenced. Those 3 days passed slower and stranger than either of them expected, filled with long stretches of conversation that had nothing to do with business or survival. Vittoria telling him, in careful pieces, about the childhood that had shaped her into someone capable of 4 years of disciplined patience. Renzo telling her, for the first time to anyone, about the weight of inheriting a name he had never asked to carry. Neither of them spoke about what was building quietly between them in those unguarded hours, but both of them felt it, present in every silence that no longer felt uncomfortable, in every glance held a beat longer than necessary. On the second night, a storm rolled in off the water, and they sat together on the covered porch watching lightning fracture the horizon, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, neither of them moving away from the proximity. "My father used to say a man who trusts easily does not survive long in this life," Renzo said quietly, watching the storm rather than her. "I built myself around that lesson for so long, I forgot to ask whether it was true or simply convenient for men like him to teach." "Trust and survival are not always opposites," Vittoria said. "Sometimes the people we trust are exactly the reason we survive at all." Is that why you told me the truth tonight, instead of simply disappearing? Renzo asked. Trust. I told you the truth because some part of me stopped being able to let you believe a lie about the only real thing that happened between us, Vittoria said, and the honesty of it seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. The final confrontation, when it came a week later, unfolded not through violence, but through a carefully constructed exchange Vittoria herself orchestrated, using her remaining leverage to broker a fragile peace between the two families, rather than the outright war his organization had been bracing for. She stood before both sides in a meeting room she had insisted on choosing herself, laying out terms with the same calm precision she had used to survive 4 years undetected, terms that ended the immediate threat against her life, while ensuring neither family could claim total victory over the other. The room was tense in the particular way rooms become tense when every person inside them is calculating exactly how much they can afford to lose. Vittoria stood at the head of the table, flanked by neither family, belonging fully to neither side, and laid out the evidence of the elder Marchetti's broken agreement alongside a proposal that would allow both families to walk away with enough dignity intact to accept peace over continued war. She watched the Caruso representatives weigh the offer, watched the remaining Marchetti loyalists search Renzo's face for some sign of how he wanted this to end, and when Renzo finally spoke in support of the terms she had drafted, the room's tension broke like a held breath finally released. Renzo watched her command that room the way he had never once watched her command anything in 4 years of marriage, and understood, with total clarity, exactly how badly he had misjudged the woman standing at his side the entire time. When it was finished, when the room had emptied and the fragile peace had been sealed with words instead of blood, Renzo turned to her in the quiet aftermath and said the thing he had been circling for days. I underestimated you the same way everyone else did, he said. That's not something I say easily, and it's not something I've ever said to anyone in my life. I know, Vittoria said. It's why it worked for 4 years. It won't work again, he said. Whatever this is between us now, I don't intend to spend it failing to see you clearly a second time. Vittoria held his gaze, weighing the truth of that promise against everything she had learned about trusting powerful men who rarely kept their word, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she believed him anyway. Then don't, she said simply. That's all I ever actually wanted from you. Not the house, not the name, not the protection, just to be seen as something more than a mistake you married for convenience. They walked out of that building together into a late afternoon that felt, to both of them, unfamiliar in its ordinariness, the war behind them settled, the future ahead of them entirely unwritten for the first time in either of their adult lives. Vittoria thought of the 4 years she had spent disappearing into a role, and Renzo thought of the 4 years he had spent failing to see the woman standing directly in front of him, and neither of them said anything for a long stretch of the walk, the silence between them comfortable in a way it had never once been during their marriage. Neither of them moved to close the space between them, not that night, both of them understanding that whatever came next deserved to be built slowly, deliberately, on truth this time instead of assumption. But Renzo reached out and rested his hand briefly against hers on the table between them, a small gesture that carried more weight than any declaration could have, and withdrew it just as quietly, leaving the promise of it lingering in the space where his hand had been. Outside the windows of that quiet meeting room, the city moved on, entirely unaware that a war nearly started by a dinner-table divorce had ended instead in something neither family had anticipated. 2 people who had spent 4 years as strangers wearing each other's names, finally choosing, with open eyes and no illusions left between them, to see where the truth might lead them next. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more suspense and romance stories just like this one, and drop a comment letting us know what you thought of Vittoria and Renzo's story. There are more stories waiting for you, so stay close, and we will see you in the next one.